romanticize the Middle Ages. Candlelit castles, knights pledging devotion, lovers exchanging vows beneath flower-draped arches. We've built an entire aesthetic around medieval romance. The chivalric ideal, the courtly love poem, the noble lady dropping her handkerchief for an armored suitor. It is a beautiful fiction, and like most beautiful fictions, it was constructed to obscure a far grimmer reality. Medieval marriage had almost nothing to do with love. It was a legal contract, an economic transaction, a political instrument, and in many cases, a life sentence handed down to people, overwhelmingly women who had no meaningful power to refuse it. To understand medieval marriage honestly is to understand one of the most fundamental systems of control ever devised by human society. Child brides. The church set 12 as the minimum marriage age for girls, 14 for boys, but these were not minimums in the modern sense. They were targets. Among the nobility, betrothals happened far earlier. Children as young as 2 or 3 were formally promised to future spouses they had never met. The contract sealed between their fathers while they were still learning to walk. By the time a noble girl reached her 12th birthday, her identity, her future household, her reproductive role in dynastic planning, all of it had been decided before she had the capacity to understand what any of it meant. She didn't choose her husband. Her father did, based on land, alliances, debt settlements, and political strategy. The girl was the currency of the transaction. Among common people, women married somewhat later, typically their late teens or early 20s, simply because poor families needed their daughter's labor at home longer and had less incentive to rush betrothals. But this didn't mean meaningfully more freedom. A peasant father's authority over his daughter's marriage was as absolute as a duke's. The mechanisms were economic rather than dynastic, but they were controlled nonetheless. The address changed. The cage didn't. Consent was a fiction. The medieval church officially required consent from both parties. Canon law was clear. A marriage performed under duress was technically invalid. This sounds almost progressive, until you examine what consent actually meant in practice. A young woman who refused an arranged marriage risked being beaten, starved, locked in a room, threatened with disinheritance, or simply worn down through relentless psychological pressure until she broke and said yes. Chroniclers of the period recorded cases of women subjected to months of confinement and systematic cruelty until they capitulated. When she finally stood before the priest and spoke the required words, that was recorded as consent. The church asked if she agreed. She said she did. The marriage was valid, but there was a more insidious mechanism at work. Girls raised from childhood in a culture that told them their entire purpose was to become a wife and bear children. Girls who had been betrothed since infancy and had never once imagined any alternative life often didn't experience their acquiescence as coercion at all. They had been shaped by the entire social order to accept it. The system had groomed them before they were old enough to question it. The yes was real. The framework that produced it was not. The wedding night medieval marriage wasn't considered legally binding until consummated. And among the nobility, consummation was not a private matter. Wedding guests accompanied the couple to the bridal chamber, watched them get into bed, made ribald jokes, and sometimes remained in the room until the act was presumed to have begun. For a girl who had married at 12 or 13, legally the minimum, and in practice not unusual among the upper classes, this was her first sexual experience, with a man often decades her senior, in a room that had minutes earlier been filled with laughing strangers. Some medical writers of the period advised that very young brides be treated gently and that consummation be delayed until they were more physically mature. Some older husbands followed this advice. Many did not. There was no enforcement mechanism. The wife had no legal recourse. Within marriage, a husband's sexual access to his wife was essentially absolute under both church doctrine and civil law. The concept of marital rape did not exist in any medieval legal framework. A wife's body belonged, by the terms of the contract itself, to her husband. Women as property. When a woman married in medieval Europe, she ceased, in most legal senses, to exist as an independent person. The doctrine of coverture held that a wife's legal identity was entirely absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property independently. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue or be sued in her own name. Any wages she earned, any inheritance she received, any goods she brought into the marriage, all of it became her husband's property the moment the vows were exchanged. The dowry system made the transaction explicit and official. A bride's family paid in money, land, or goods to transfer her into another household. That payment represented her entire share of her family's estate, handed over in advance. Once transferred, she had no further claim on her birth family's wealth, ever. In return, the groom was expected to designate a dower, a portion of his estate to support her if he died first. In theory, protective. In practice, widows routinely found themselves in bitter legal battles with their late husbands' families, battles they frequently lost. A medieval widow's children could be seized, her lands taken, her future made entirely dependent on the goodwill of people with every incentive to minimize her claims. Violence was permitted. The church and civil law both permitted a husband to physically discipline his wife. The rule of thumb, the idea that a man could beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb, is likely apocryphal as a specific legal statute, but it reflects something genuinely real. Moderate physical correction of a wife was considered not just acceptable, but in some moral frameworks, a husband's duty. A man who couldn't control his wife risked public shame. Beating her was a recognized solution to that problem. Women had virtually no legal protection from domestic violence within marriage. Courts might intervene in cases of extreme, life-threatening abuse, but the bar was extraordinarily high. The burden of proof fell entirely on the wife, and making accusations publicly marked a woman as someone who had failed to maintain her household's peace. She would typically be seen as the problem, regardless of what her husband had done. Some women did escape through legal separation. The church permitted separation of bed and board in cases of proven adultery or life-threatening cruelty. But this required witnesses, resources, and courage to pursue a legal process that was slow, expensive, and deeply uncertain. For most women, there was simply no exit. The marriage was the life, and the life was the marriage until death. The noble women who had no choice. Either nowhere was the transactional nature of medieval marriage more nakedly visible than among the ruling classes, where unions were instruments of geopolitics conducted in human flesh. A medieval king didn't marry for companionship. He married to end wars, secure borders, and produce male heirs. His bride was selected by council, her value evaluated according to her family's political weight, and her apparent physical capacity to bear children. Her opinion was not a factor. Margaret Beaufort, one of the most formidable women of the 15th century, was married at 12 to a man of 24. She gave birth at 13, a delivery that nearly killed her and likely damaged her reproductive capacity permanently. Catherine of Aragon was betrothed at birth, married at 15, widowed at 16, then traded between her father and father-in-law like an unclaimed parcel for years while men negotiated her future. These were the most powerful, educated, politically visible women of their era, and still they were pieces on a chessboard, moved entirely by men. The uncomfortable truth. Some medieval marriages did produce genuine love. Letters survive between spouses that are tender, warm, and clearly affectionate. Some arranged matches became true partnerships. Human beings are resilient, and love can grow in unlikely soil. But happy accidents don't redeem a broken system. Medieval marriage wasn't designed to make women happy. It was designed to manage property, produce legitimate heirs, and maintain social order. That some women found happiness within it is a testament to human resilience, not to the justice of the institution. The flowers on the altar were real. The vows were spoken in good faith by people who believed in them. And behind all of it, the contract was written by men about women for reasons that had nothing to do with love.